Good day and welcome to another edition of Crapper. It's a solo episode today. I shall be looking at Air Conditioning by Curved Air, which is one of my favourite of the efforts by the UK progressive rock movement. And I think in the 60s in London there were various sort of experimental bands that were emerging. One thinks of Pink Floyd, one thinks of Soft Machine, maybe Henry Cow, maybe the Nice were part of this milieu. And I think Curved Air was probably present at this time and to some extent part of that movement. It's an interesting mix of personalities, Curved Air. I'll name them. We have Sonia Christina on voice, the lovely Sonia Christina, as my sexist comment for the day. And then the lovely, I'll make it equitable, the lovely Daryl Way on violin, the lovely Francis Monkman on keyboards and guitar, the lovely Rob Martin on bass, and the lovely Florian Pilkington Mix on drums. Florian Pilkington Mixer, obviously, is famously difficult to pronounce double-barreled name. It sounds like a device, doesn't it? Florian Pilkington Mixer. Anyway, I think that this is the combination of these elements of these people makes for a very interesting mix. You'll note that the keyboard player is also a guitarist, but one of the lead instruments is the violin. And I think it makes for a sort of a unique sound, really. I would say that this is a rockish band, so to speak, in the sense that they're not always voice-led. You know, pop music tends to be more voice-led, and Sonia Christina's voice is amazing, and it's very present here, but she's often using it almost as if it were a musical instrument, and the melodic lines are often led by the violin or even by the keyboards sometimes, and even by the guitar as well. So that puts it more in the rock category, I think. It's not necessarily voice-led, this music. I think, was it Robert Fripp who said that King Crimson were like Hendrix playing Bartok? But here we've got sort of, let's say, Hendrix playing Vivaldi, because this is more of a classical and rock fusion band, I would say, you know, using classical in the sort of more literal sense rather than the metaphorical sense. It's three great albums, this band, in my opinion. In the first period, which is the sort of the famous period, let's say, the first three albums were amazing. And then they did another three albums which were not quite as well thought of, including by me. I think Kant talks about the sublime in his third critique, the sublime, of course, being a feeling of awe when faced with wondrous nature or an incredible historical event or an artistic event. I would say that the sublime is present in those first three albums. The following three albums are good, but they're not sublime. Let's put it that way. I'm a huge fan of this first album. I'm a huge fan of the second album. For me, the second album is the best one, although not according to the All Music review, who say that it represents a lacuna before they get back on track with the third album. I don't agree with that. I think this first album is completely brilliant. I think it's basically a perfect album. I think the second album is a perfect album and perhaps even more coherent than the first album, and therefore let's say I love it more. The third album has got amazing tracks, and it's a wonderful construction until the very end. I think the ending of the suite on side 2, I think, is thrown away. Basically, it's not a bad track, but they've chosen like the worst possible track to end the album on. You could almost any other track would have been better than the one they finally chose to close the third album, Phantasmagoria. It reminds me a little bit actually of Joe's Garage by Frank Zappa, which whose penultimate track is Watermelon in Easter Hay, is that right? Which is a beautiful, beautiful track. And then the final track is, I can't remember what it is, the one about the muffins, which is just a ridiculous ending to a triple concept album. So for me, Phantasmagoria, the third Curved Air album, has sort of echoes that slight aesthetic slip. But I think it's still a good album. But as I say, it's like the dimension of the sublime, I think, is only really present on the first three albums. Do I want to say anything about the album cover? No. It's not my place. But I do think it's very aesthetic. It's got slight pagan vibes because it's got this image of a witchy woman, sort of repeated over and over again, round in a circle, almost like circling the middle of the album. And that witchish vibe is something that Sonia Christina is often trying to evoke. Excuse me. That's an interesting play on words. When she was on stage. But anyway, I mean, it sort of goes with the image of the band, and it's also fairly aesthetic. It was the first ever picture disc, as people might know. And as anyone who knows who's ever played a picture disc, that was a bad idea because it's picture discs sound terrible. Anyway, yes, it works, the cover, let's say, and with that, let's turn to the tracks. Now, track 1 is a sort of paradigm Curved Air track. It Happened Today. This is a really great track, and one of their most famous, I guess. I believe it might have been issued as a single. It starts with a series of violin ostinatos over a shifting chord sequence. And then what happens is, and that leads the track. So as I said before, the violin's kind of leading things. Then the voice comes in, and Sonia Christina does a sort of a different ostinato pattern, which sort of mirrors the violin ostinato pattern, but it's not exactly the same. And as she repeats this pattern, the chord sequence that originally accompanied the violin opening is extended. So that's a nice sort of development. Slightly reminds me of the chord development in The Thoughts of Emilis Davjak by The Nice. So there's another classical reference for you. Now, so they go violin, voice, violin, voice, violin, voice. So it's a kind of repetitive cycle, and they need to do something else at some point in the track. There's no, as it were, middle eight. So what they do actually at the end is that they go into a completely different section, which the first part was in a minor key, the second part is in the major key. My interpretation of this ending, which is a major key violin theme, is that it's a representation of the it in the title. It happened today. You know what? It's it. You know this. What's it? It's it. What is it? To quote Faith No More. You know what happened today? It happened today. What happened today? It. Right. Now this reminds me of the French philosopher Alain Badiou, who talks about the event, you know, which is something which is not domesticable to normal conventional time frames. In a sense, it creates its own temporality. It emerges essentially out of nothing and creates its own sort of temporal spread, as it were. I think Badiou's partly influenced here by, you know, sort of quantum mechanics and things like that, and there's definitely a sort of quantum mechanics element in the lyrics to this Curved Air track, It Happened Today, you know, because it happened today, and then what you've got is this is the now, as it were, the absolute now, and then you've got the past and the future, and they don't have independent existence. They're sort of threaded through the eye of the needle of the event in the present, so to speak. So they say, yesterday, you know, it never really happened. Tomorrow, you know, it never really had. You're only what you think you might be. I am only what you think I am. And then, what I was, I find it hard to be now. Now I am, and very soon you'll feel. You keep telling me the time is telling. I tell you the time will tell in time. So again, there's a sort of looping between future and present, past and present. And this is the emblematic of the of the event. So anyway, this is a wonderful, fascinating opening track. Love it. Track 2 is called Stretch, first of a series of one word titles on this album. Don't know why. This is a lovely track. Keeps the party going, keeps the plates spinning. It starts with an impossible time signature in the introduction, which I don't begin to understand. It could just be me, but it doesn't seem to bear any relationship to the rest of the track. Again, a sort of violin flourish over the top. Then it goes into the track proper starts, and it's a kind of fast 6/8 blues rock swing. So again, you've got this sort of marriage of the American, the blues rock, and the European. You know, the classical violin. You know, Vivaldi-esque. We'll come back to Vivaldi, of course, later on, because there's a track on this album called Vivaldi. So yeah, but you've got this, again, the meeting of two worlds, which I think is emblematic of British rock and pop music in general, like European and American, and but in a very sort of specific way when it comes to a band like Curved Air. Again, this has an unusual structure, this one. It has a sort of this weird intro, and then there's the song, this sort of almost Jethro Tull-ish blues rock number. And then the middle section, before we go back to the song at the end, the middle section, which you would think is a sort of variation, is actually goes off into another universe. You have, again, a series of sort of violin ostinatos over a series of chromatic chords, which either ascend or descend, depending on where you are in the middle eight. It's very exciting, that. Almost makes the track for me, actually. And but it's unexpected, you know. This thing about the tension between the expected and the unexpected is really what you want from your art, isn't it? That's what it's all about. Again, very characteristic lyrics, sort of weird, kind of surreal, psychedelic poem. Stretch the mildest morning when I got to be out of bed, crazy dreams still floating in the mist around my head. Since I met that frown, saw others think they're fair. For me, I prefer those loving smiles in a dozen. It must have been. It's kind of sort of almost like free association. But very works well, I think. Very aesthetic. Now, track 3. I think track 3, which is called Screw, is a risque title. A sort of risque hippie title. Remember, this is the era of free love. Sonia Christina was actually in the musical Hair, right? So that kind of ties in here somehow. But yeah, I think this track, this third track, side 1, third track, Screw, is sort of a key track, really. It's a wonderful track, in my opinion. And I think it's very characteristic of their unusual writing style. It's a sort of slow 4-prog meander. There's a sort of mellotron part in it. On the main riff, I guess played by Francis Monkman. So it sounds almost a little bit like something off Foxtrot by Genesis. And it's based on a very weird mode, the tune as the piece opens, which I don't know what it is. I wouldn't know how to explain it, but I know it's a sort of major key, but it's with a, I think, augmented fifth. Or is it called a diminished sixth? So it sounds almost like Middle Eastern. Da 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 da. Not sure what the name of that mode is. Maybe it doesn't have a name. I don't know. But yeah, it's a sort of. It almost sounds like Egyptian or something. Like they're doing a tribute to ancient Egypt. And they developed this tune over the weirdest chord sequence I've ever heard, I think, in a pop song. Starts in F sharp minor with an ascending fifth, almost like the James Bond theme. Da, 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 da. Then it goes to F sharp major. Then, get this, D, C minor, F sharp major, D, A sus4, so A sharp sus4, A sharp minor, so the third sort of descends through semitones. Um, B, B with an A in the bass, G major 7, and then the whole thing resolves into a sort of funky, sort of slightly Pink Floyd-esque E minor to A riff. Da 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 da. That's a beautiful interval, I think. Um, but yeah, I mean, it all works because the melody that snakes around this, either in the voice or in the violin, is very works incredibly well and is quite curiously catchy. But it almost feels like they're changing key with every chord in the sequence, right? But as I say, the melody has such a nice shape that you don't really even notice. So again, the tension between the expected and the unexpected at work here. But yeah, it's totally original. Never heard anything like it before. Very beautiful. Love it. If you don't like the sum total of this whole package, then this band ain't for you. But it is for me. Okay. Track 4 is called Blind Man, which is a brilliant contrast from what's come so far. It's a different kind of mood, different vibe, if you will. It's a slightly folky number, so there's an echo of Sonia Christina's past here because she started in folk clubs in Brentwood, as by the way did Paul Simon from Simon and Garfunkel. I don't know if it was the same folk club, but the members of Crap are all from Brentwood or have lived around Brentwood for a long time, so we're familiar with all these clubs. So it's got special significance for us. But anyway, yeah. So this is a folky, sort of folky approach on this one. Sounds slightly like Joni Mitchell. There's a very strange lyric about a loss of social connection because of blindness. So this guy's blindness here is operating as a metaphor, of course, for a lack of social connection. But he's got his dog, so it's a sort of one man and his dog type scenario, to quote the name of a famous BBC show from the 70s and 80s. So yeah, it's but I think it's I don't know. Where is the lyric here? Again, it's got a sort of surreal vibe. I'll be your purse if you will come back and set the blind man to his door. If man's best friend will be my friend until the bitter end. Loneliness is the friend I knew, has ceased the script at last. This emptiness I always felt has been replaced by you. Who knows what this is about, really? But it's evocative of something. What I wanted to mention about this track is that Sonia Christina does a great job. I mentioned earlier she occasionally uses her voice like as if it were a musical instrument. And I think she does a great job here of interrupting the communication in the voice. Because so the line is broken up, so it's interrupted in the same way that the communication is interrupted according to this very surreal set of lyrics. So this is a programmatic feature again, which I think is very clever. It's very easy to miss these details, but they all add up to a very interesting whole, And actually that vocal part resolves once again into a violin melody, which is very beautiful, So once again, the voice is not the key instrument here. The melody is being carried by the violin, right? And by the way, there's in the penultimate moment in this track, there's a quick change from minor key from major key to minor key and then back again, which adds a bit of drama just before the song finishes, which again is a nice touch. Rather subtle, but works well. Now, track 5 is the sort of epic closer to side 1. It's called Vivaldi, as I was trailing earlier on. Now, this is an instrumental track, the first instrumental track on the album. It's a showcase for Darrell Way, the violinist. I think especially live. I mean, they made this into a sort of centerpiece of the set, I think. It shows his importance in the early band. which was never in doubt. But I mean, at this point, he was there's a sort of way Monkman dialectic in the writing and in the performance as well, I suppose. The other members of the band are important as well, but at the level of sort of construction, musical construction, it's the way Monkman dialectic that you're looking for. So this is, as I say, a paradigm piece. This is a bit like Moby Dick by Led Zeppelin played on the violin, if you can imagine that. Or something by ELP or The Nice or something like that. Why is it called Vivaldi? Well, they take a sort of fragment from the Four Seasons. I think it's from Winter. It's just a few bars, and then they add a tune over the top, and then the full band comes in, a sort of tutti section with the full band. And it sounds a bit like sort of Thunderstruck by AC/DC at that point. But it's quite exciting, that bit, I have to say. Then what we have is a solo violin in the middle. The band drops out and the violin is just playing on its own for quite a long time, right? A la Moby Dick. The first part of that is quite lilting, sort of is more classical and more sober, perhaps is the word. But then as it goes on, it becomes more electronic and more modernist and more experimental. So this is not exactly a classical rock fusion band. It's a classical modernist rock fusion band in a way. It becomes clear at this point. I do love the violin playing here. I think it's very beautiful and very exciting by turns. Slightly reminiscent, I think, of Lark's Tongues in Aspic, David Cross. In fact, specifically Lark's Tongues in Aspic Part 1. But I think the main attraction of this track is, as I say, the tutti sections where the whole band is playing. I think those sections are really, really bracing. This might not be quite as sort of integrated a track as something like Screw, but I mean, they're trying to do something a bit different here, so it doesn't really matter. And of course, the variety is welcome, as it often is with these sorts of bands. They have different strings to their bow, excuse the pun. Now, let's move to side 2. This starts with a track called Hide and Seek. This is not the greatest track, but it's fairly characteristic because, as usual, it's full of surprises. It starts in a slow 6/8 rhythm and has sort of the sort of typical sort of dissonant chords that they've been developing at various points. But it does sort of resolve tonically in the minor key and then goes into a nice strident guitar melody with the same pulse, but 4/4 rather than 6/8 at this point. It occurs to me that these two opening sections actually mirror, in a way, the opening to Purple Haze by Jimi Hendrix, who was clearly an influence on this band. I mean, Francis Monkman has said it himself. Monkman Dixit. It's interesting how classical musicians like Francis Monkman were so fascinated with Jimi Hendrix, Hendrix seems to tick all the boxes for everybody in a way. By the way, Francis Monkman was a classical musician in the sense I think he'd studied... Darrell Way studied at the Royal College. I'm not sure whether Francis Monkman did, but I think he definitely had a classical background. Of course, he later went on to be in Sky, right? First couple of Sky albums, sort of the Sky project was initiated by Monkman, and he then went on to do library music and some soundtracks. He wrote the soundtrack to The Long Good Friday, which is a sort of epic mafia film from my childhood, based in London. It was a sort of iconic film at the time. And it's about whether the London mafia trumps the IRA. That's to say whether politics trumps, society. It's very interesting film. Actually, that's a spoiler. I've just done a spoiler, sorry. Just done a spoiler. That's a spoiler on a par with, Kevin Spacey's Kaiser Soze. Anyway, never mind. But the music to that film is really great. And that's by Francis Monkman. Anyway, so where were we? Um, there's time change after those two opening sections here in Hide and Seek. The track speeds up into a sort of gallop. By the way, the drumming is very good on this track. I mean, Pilkington Mixer, is that how you say it? He's an interesting drummer. He's not doing necessarily conventional drumming, but neither is it conventional rock drumming or pop drumming, but neither is it jazz drumming exactly. So it almost feels like he's a drummer in a percussionist in the classical orchestra. He's doing something different with his hands, making different choices. And this is one of those when it starts to gallop. He's doing something weird in the gallop and it on the toms, I think, and it sounds very interesting. But yeah, I think the time changes are interesting here, but I think basically it's still the harmonic developments that are the key to the interest in this song, right? So thanks, Mr. Monkman, for that. This is a sort of post-apocalyptic lyric, hide and seek. So I have the lyrics here in front of me. Yeah, it's about someone, a woman sort of wandering through a post-apocalyptic landscape looking for a guy, I think, looking for a partner, her partner, where are you, etc. Just sort of Curved Air's version of Talking World War III Blues by Bob Dylan. We're so familiar with these apocalyptic landscapes now because of after, Walking Dead and... The Last of Us and things like that. This all feels fairly pat, fairly stock at this point. I think there was a quote I think by the American philosopher Frederick Jameson, who said that it's easier to imagine the end of the world than it is to imagine the end of capitalism. Well, here you go. Right. Okay, track number 2 on side 2 is Propositions. This apparently was a key track from the perspective of the band. Not sure about that personally. Again, not my favourite, but I think it's quite interesting. But they thought it was really interesting. I'll tell you why in a second. But before I do, let's just say that it starts with a sort of, again, dissonant, Hendrixy sort of riff. Because it's got sort of stabs in it, Hendrixy style stabs. It's got sort of... it's a kind of cool rock track, this, very up-tempo, very sort of stabby, very exciting. Nice musical ornaments, and this time especially from the voice, because Sonia Christina sings, I've found a nice way to die. So the die is sort of seems to be onomatopoeic. She's losing breath. I'm going to die. It's almost punkish, actually. But this is all, as I say, rather quite exciting. But I think the reason why they thought this was a key track, particularly Francis Monkman, is because of the middle. Because again, it goes off into a completely different universe in the middle. And this middle is sort of inspired by early minimalism, I think. And what I didn't realise until recently, because I checked it out, is that Francis Monkman was in the original performance, I think, of In C by Terry Riley, who was whose album A Rainbow and Curved Egg, gave birth to the band Curved Air. The name yielded a name to the band Curved Air, right? So Frank Monkman was obviously influenced by Riley, and I think that this middle bit is sort of looped, as and repetitive, as you would expect in a minimalist piece, because minimalist music is often called repetitive music. And then right at the end, it goes back into the rock track. But I think that middle bit is a sort of new departure for them. So there's a lot of, as I say, this is sort of classical music mixed with modernist music and even some sort of postmodern stuff in here as well. So that's cool. Track 3 on side 2 is called Rob 1. This is another instrumental piece. This is a nice moment of peace after the sort of slightly chaotic scales and sound of tracks 1 and 2 on side 2, Hide and Seek and Propositions. So there's some good programming at work here, programming in the sense of, sequencing. The beautiful lilting violin tune, accompanied by some interesting piano chords. Again, the Way Monkman dialectic at work here for your pleasure. The violin continues throughout the track, but actually it's got three different harmonic variations under it. And the violin line changes slightly around them. And that is where the interest comes in for this track here. Like there's the changes in the harmony. The harmony gradually changes to a more and more exciting sequence. And I think, again, this is a nice Monkman initiative, right? I don't know whether one has to be a piano player to think of such interesting chords. You know, you think about Tony Banks in Genesis. The way that he puts chord sequences together is really interesting, and I think because on the piano, your fingers can do lots of different things that they can't do on a guitar. If you know what I mean, that might allow you to think more laterally than a guitar player would, for example. Anyway, that's another lovely track. Now we get to Situations, track 4, side 2. I think this is the climax of the album, really. I think this is a wonderful piece. And it's a quiet, very quiet, slow, pastoral verse. How do you pronounce that word? Although it's got a certain ominous character, even though it's calm. And then you get a louder and faster chorus coming in, which is sort of classic rock construction. But it's "See what a fool I've been," she sings on the chorus, and this is it's got sort of drum rolls in the background. It's very exciting, that bit. So the contrast is lovely, and it's just a really great chorus, this. And so you feel like this could be a sort of comfortable resting place for the album, even though there is a sort of coda afterwards, track 5, but we'll come back to that. Track 4, Situations, has a sort of goes into a middle bit which is a bit more complex. It's a sort of twinkling. I think it's called like sweet picking on the guitar. Here I've called it twinkly in my notes. Twinkly contrasting section. Then leading to a sort of Hendrixy guitar solo over a drone. So again, you've got this Eastern influence here. Then it goes back to the twinkles, and then back to the song. So it's almost an arch, this track. Although it does go back to the sweet picking right at the end as a sort of like an actual coda to the track, assuming that the rest of the track is an arch. But yeah, so it's got this sort of it's a bit more involved, this structure, a little bit like Screw, actually, track 3, side 1, slightly more complex structure, and it's obviously very carefully constructed. The words this time are based on a longer poem, surreal poem, a bit more existential this time. It's a woman regretting not having an affair or something like that. But it's a bit more serious, a bit more engaged, a bit more involved, and I like the total package here, and I think this is a very satisfying end to the album. It's not actually the end to the album because we've got a track 5, Vivaldi with Canon. So this is a reprise of Vivaldi at the end of the first side, but it's called with Canons, meaning Vivaldi with modernism, really. If we can associate rather liberally modernism with the Industrial Revolution, like the military. The rise of military technology, because it's done very differently here, the piece. This is only a minute and a half long, this track, so it's not really, as I say, it's a bit like a sort of bye-bye, closing credits sort of thing. But what they do is they do a reprise of the tune at the beginning of Vivaldi, but no, it's not the beginning. Sorry, it's actually the Thunderstruck section. But this time they do it with sort of ambient synth sounds, right? So it's a much weirder iteration of the piece, which maybe is supposed to tell a story. I don't know. Like we had the past and now we're going forward into the future, but without losing any of our aesthetic criteria. Who knows? And then it suddenly ends with a little explosion. It's a little explosion. It's not a. It's a bang, but it's a bang that's a bit like a whimper. To paraphrase T.S. Eliot. The poem "The Hollow Men" by T.S. Eliot. This is the way the world ends. Not with a bang, but with a whimper, which is invoked at the end of Apocalypse Now by Francis Ford Coppola. Anyway, I hope that's given you a little introduction to the album. It's a brilliant album. It works so well as a totality. It's so well put together, so well sequenced, and I just love it. It's one of those albums that you could just play forever and get a frisson from it, in my opinion. But what's your opinion? Why don't you tell me in the comments? And please don't forget to like and subscribe, because that would be lovely if you've enjoyed it. Okay, and I'll see you on the next crapper. Ta-ra!